I want to sketch some points of connection between new materialism and my approach to screen media, and specifically mobile media, urban screens, media architecture, as it is informed by media theory, performance theory, and cultural analysis, and with a focus on the materiality, relationality, and spatio-temporally dynamic movements and structures that audiovisual communication technologies work with and within. I would even say that such media theory is a new materialist in its core, or that new materialism is a form of media theory. In my work, recurring tropes are cartography, archaeology, or genealogy, and architecture in the analysis of the space-making, time-taking, and relationship-shaping properties of media technologies and design, and the concepts that may help to reflect on how their configurations produce experiences, meanings, knowledge, subjectivity. And I want to show you a presentation that I gave recently for a conference organized in Japan, well, online, unfortunately. And while it was a keynote in that conference, I actually resisted their proposed central concept, which was the doubling of reality. And in my talk, I gave some sort of response to that notion of doubling of reality that I think, in a way, addresses some of the core ideas of new materialism. And one of the things that I refer to somewhere in the talk is that I look at design as objects to think with, to think about their properties as maybe in a way also philosophical or theoretical statements. And I'm very much looking forward to exchange ideas and experiences and expertise with you in how concepts and theoretical mini theories that concepts really are, how these can be design materials. So sort of flipping the perspective. But for now, let me start the presentation that I gave in Japan, or Japan online. Let me see if this works. Sorry for the struggling here, but I think it's fitting with this time. Hi, thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation. I regret not being able to travel and to all meet in the same location, and also to now have to record this presentation in my home office in Rotterdam, in the Netherlands. I'm not in a studio. And personally, I am still getting used to the way of presenting in this way, and having to record myself while being confronted with my own screen image. So my apologies in advance for anything that in this performance that reflects my unease with the format. Also, first, I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation to contribute in this way to this very timely symposium that asks us to reflect on the impact of mobile and locative technologies on how we experience time and our position within reality, or possibly realities, plural. This question is indeed relevant in light of the pervasive presence of mobile locative screening technologies in our lives, it is urgent, as these technologies are developing and changing fast, and important because of their societal and cultural impact. And reflecting on how these technologies have an impact on our perception of and relating to reality in light of the theme of this symposium, I cannot help being affected by the conditions of the current moment, as impacted by the global pandemic and our local responses to COVID-19. Perhaps our relating to personal microscreens has intensified, while our physical mobility, actionability, and experiences in public space have been greatly impacted by rules for and temporary design for physical distancing. So in the following, I want to briefly address first some observations about urban screen culture of the current moment. I want to sketch some perspectives that I work with in my approach to mobile and urban screen cultures. And I want to make a conceptual proposal in response to the symposium's question about the doubling of reality. First, some observations. In terms of mobility, we encountered the spatial-temporal paradox of screens as mediating and space-making surfaces, daily working from home or our mobile office, fixating us in front of our devices, registering our micro-movements while connecting with others that are elsewhere doing the same thing. But also en route, in transit, and sharing public spaces with others, possibly each in our own vehicular bubble, where screens may pause, block, or reroute our passages, such as we can see in this image in the slide, where screens are giving us instructions of how to move in public space. We also use the canvases of and above our built environment as screens for posting messages as commentary or subtitles in response to what is happening on street level or below, layering and thereby also infusing the places, but also our times of living and dwelling in various ways. And again, in the slide, some contemporary examples of messages, for example, as thanks to healthcare workers in this time of pandemic. Some local initiatives explore possibilities for temporary interventions in public space and, for example, use existing architectural surfaces for projections. And they demonstrate how screening can be mobile and migratory and contemporarily transform and intervene in public space by repurposing structures and materials around us, repositioning us, making us stop and halt, sit down, to take in the spectacle and to relate, reflect, and respond in the encounter. Screens can also intervene in or destabilize our experience of time in various ways, and perhaps specifically so in the current moment of uncertainty. So-called contact tracing apps, but also data dashboards, or called corona dashboards at the moment, that suggest to give real-time information about the spread of the coronavirus, cannot live up to this promise. Yet they're continuously updated and therefore always inherently incomplete and retrospective data have an impact on our present and future movements and behaviors. With my colleague at Utrecht University, performance studies scholar Sigrid Merks and I have recently published a short essay on what we call the intermediacy of this moment. These times of intermediacy are characterized by instabilities, transformations, and frictions on different spatial, that is local, but also national or global, as well as temporal, that is, short to long-term scales. We need to reinvent the parameters of mobility and rules of engagement in public space, not only in response to the pandemic, but also in various forms of activism and public protest, as they are taking place in metropoles around the globe. In our essay, we use the concept of scenographic figurations as a lens to analyze examples of temporary design and redesign in and of urban public spaces. And on this slide, you can see two examples that we highlight in the essay. On the left, you can see the use of projections on monuments changing their status and meaning as temporary interventions reflecting debates in public space about the frictions within this space. Or on the right, an example of so-called design for distance, a smart distancing system developed by artists Jolan van der Wiel and Nick Verstand, thinking about ways to use laser projections for enabling mobility within the regulations for physical distancing in potentially crowded spaces of transit, such as shopping malls, city centers, or railway stations. A little bit about my perspective. I'm interested in screens and practices of screening in public space, the street level, as perhaps a primary site of encounter between individuals, but which is also a domain shaped by discursive, historical, and institutional framings and infrastructural regulations, and a primary place for frictions, contestation, and interventions. I have a specific interest in creative, experimental, artistic, and also activist design. Design and use that responds to, works with, and reflects on the affordances of new and emerging technologies, such as algorithmic technologies, sensing technologies, geolocative, interactive, and mobile technologies, for the way that they situate us within and produce possibilities for engaging and relating with the world around us, and also the socio-political frictions that they can bring about. Mobile media, location-based art, installations, urban screens, and media architecture is for me a variegated field of innovation and experimentation, social engagement, reflexivity, and criticality with and about these technologies that is taking place literally where it matters, in public spaces, on the street, and in the here and now. This field entails a wide bracket of screening phenomena, often singular and location-specific projects that are situated, performative, and relational. I'm interested in approaching such screening instances as thinking objects or objects to think with. And in the context of the theme of this symposium, the way that as our cases they make proposals to think through their situated, performative, and relational workings of what realities, plural, we engage with. So in a recent special issue on what we have conceptualized urban interfaces, my co-editors Michiel de Lange and Sigrid Merks, both colleagues at Utrecht University, with my co-editors, I have proposed to understand screen-based media, art and performance in public space as simultaneous sites and apparatuses that afford various forms of interaction with and within these spaces. Central to our question was how urban interfaces can act as privileged sites to negotiate contemporary frictions in and about these spaces. The use of graffiti in commercial areas, the artistic and critical redressing of shop windows, or augmented reality annotations of routes through the city provide cases in point. And from a performative notion of interfaces, or rather interfacing, we emphasize the materiality, mediality, and performativity of urban technologies and other forms of spatial-temporal design, so as to connect their material specificity with their effective, actionable, and relational affordances. This perspective of the interfacing highlights the situational, performative, and relational dynamics of screening practices, and problematizes thinking in terms of two clear distinctions between different realities or pre-existing entities on the one hand, while on the other it makes more specific and potentially analyzable the intersections and dynamics of emergent processes that are involved. To be more specific, this performative perspective, I think, proposes a shift from an entity logics to an event logics that I think couldn't be helpful in thinking of our mediated realities here in the context of this symposium as well. In another recent publication, in a collection that was actually co-edited by Adriana recently, Pauline Drescher and I suggested the concept of crossing as a perspective for augmented reality, virtual reality, and mixed reality, and everything in between and beyond, as with the aim to do justice to the way that these technologies afford various ways of relating. And in order to open up thinking in terms of flexible registers, rather than ontological essences of virtual, augmented, or mixed realities. When we consider the common use of the word crossing, we can see that it both denotes an act, a moment and place. It denotes elements within a process and an outcome. And this, I find, reflects the performative nature of the phenomenon that we're looking at. Perhaps crossing can make more precise a notion of doubling, as much as augmenting, virtualizing, or mixing reality. As a concept, it can bring into perspective the intersecting of, or indeed crossing, of situatedness, performativity, and relationality involved in the screening in and of mobility. For example, it asks the question of how entities do not pre-exist but co-emerge in specific situations of relating. It asks how our perception of these emergent situations and within these emergent situations impact how we act, how we understand and experience in the process of this relating. It also brings in perspective the transformative and mobilizing dynamics of these processes. Adopting the lens of crossing in the examples I touched upon here, but also elsewhere, we can see a fundamental multiplicity, not only between each situation of interfacing, in that they represent different technologies, different domains, and affordances, but also a multiplicity in the way that each demonstrates a multiplication of mobilization that crossing entails. Mobilization can mean an activation and making mobile, sometimes also a destabilizing of positions. Mobilization is also a response to already existing mobilities and dynamics. And we can see this form of mobilization as a design principle. Shaping and steering flows or forms of mobility can also be conceived of as a form of mobilization. And I would say that these three can be present and co-present in the way that these screening situations offer or demonstrate forms of crossing of realities. When we consider the activating, responding, shaping and also intervening aspects of mobilizing screen technologies and interfaces in our constructions of reality, we perhaps cannot speak of ontological distinctions and essences so much, but rather we should instead think in terms of inherently multiple, emerging, and transforming registers of realities plural. Thank you for watching this presentation, and I look forward very much to discussing this further with you in one of the upcoming online meetups. And I have to, how do I get rid of that? I have to agree with my former self. As I was listening to my own voice, which I don't really like, but I couldn't help thinking of how the principle of crossing is actually also demonstrated in the reactivation of this performance, of this recording, in this particular recording. As I said, I'm very eager to think more about the relationship between concepts as lenses, or thinking of specific design objects as objects to think with on the one hand, and how that connects with how concepts and thought can be the materials to design with. There's several concepts that were present throughout the talk that connect to some concepts that we'll revisit throughout the coming weeks. I don't think I have to point them out, but as I initially thought that the talk was very much about the principle of crossing, which I do think is a very productive concept in itself, I think when we listen to it or think about it, about the argument or the proposals that I make in this talk, it really invokes a lot more of the central ideas of new materialism, and I hope that it provides some fruitful groundwork for further discussions.